What is up, everybody, and welcome to another World of Warcraft live developer Q&A. My name is Josh Allen. Joining me, as usual, Game Director Ion Hazzikostas. Ion.
Great to be here, as always.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
How's it going? So we have a ton of questions that came in. We're going to start off with a few questions about everyone's favorite recent topic, which is Azariah armor. I know we've been saying a lot about Azariah armor recently, but just getting some clarifications out here would probably be good.
Sure.
So let's get into it. First question comes from Azamain, who asked, during the last update on Azariah armor, you mentioned adding another ring with spec-specific traits only. Will items be set up so that the same trait doesn't appear more than once between the two rings? So we posted recently that the new Azariah gear being added in Tides of Vengeance will have a fifth ring on the outer edge.
Exactly. Yes, from the Battle of Azariah lore and the subsequent Season 2 gear from Dungeons and PvP. So yes, there's an extra outer ring that has 2 spec-specific Azariah traits per spec. So that's up to 8 unique traits if you are a druid with 4 specs, 4 if you're a demon hunter, 6 for most people. And no, those will always be different than the single spec specific trait on what is currently the outer ring. So effectively, you're going to have access to 3 different traits out of 6 or 7 total available. This will triple the availability of any given trait. So if you've been looking for, I just really want at least 1 point in this thing that increases the radius of my healing rain or increases the uptime of Demo Shout on my Prot Warrior or whatever, and you've been pigeonholed into just 1 or 2, items that you can seek out, you'll have 3 times as many options, as well as always picking up and opening up, any new Azariah armor that you get with a meaningful choice between 2 spec-specific traits as you go from there.
Okay. It's only the spec-specific traits that are on the outside? It's not the generic, dagger in the back and so on?
Exactly. Those. So basically, just imagine the current pieces that you're seeing that have, 3 rings in the central node. And those will stay the same. So if there's a piece from a dungeon, that will still have that exact set that you're accustomed to seeing, or from emissaries or whatever. But in Season 2, and then all the new gear from Azariah lore is being built to have a new outer ring around it. So it's going to be this 5th outer ring that has between 4 and 8 traits, depending on your class, and only spec-specific ones. So no generics.
Okay. Cool. So that also means that there's no, just to clarify the sort of intent behind the question here, there's no doubling up on the same trait inside any given piece.
You'll be able to get up to 3 stacks at most if you have the same trait on all 3 of your slots. That'll still be the case, except now getting 3 stacks of the same trait pretty much means that's all you're doing with all of your Azariah gear. Whereas here, you'd still have 3 more trait selections to complement those, whether it's going to stack 3 of a different one or spreading it more evenly to get a single point in a few different ones that don't have stacking components, so you can get some different utility enhancements. Again, the goal here is just more customization, more access to different traits that you want, and more choices.
Cool. Next question came from War, who's we're still talking about Azariah here, who said, would you consider changing the Azariah system to have traits saved spec-based versus item-based? Having 1 set of 380 shoulders is so frustrating to balance between specs that I avoid other content due to reforging. This has been one of the more common suggestions we've seen, similar to tier gear, how in previous expansions, your tier set pieces, the set bonuses would change based on what spec you were, asking to do the same thing for Azariah armor.
Yeah, so I think set pieces in past expansions were kind of an exception to the standard rules when it comes to items. And the reason why we went down that road was it felt a little odd to literally get the exact same, you need 2 of the same item from the same boss with the same art, with the same name, just to cover both balance and resto or balance and feral. And so having it be a single piece that could change made sense in that context. But that was an exception to the normal standard, where a key difference between character-based things, which can be smoothly and seamlessly changed, and item-based things is that items are a bit more firm, a bit more static. This is, if you look at how most items work, whether you have a one-hand weapon and a shield for your prot spec, but you need a 2-hander to play arms, or you get a specific trinket based on your loot spec that is for healing or otherwise, if you want to play another spec, you generally want to seek out another item in that slot. Similarly, then there are also some generic ones. If you have a trinket that is just primary proc secondary or secondary proc primary, that might work for both. And so I think that's sort of our default posture with these items. Now, in many ways, Azariah armor is more flexible than a default item, where if I've collected a full set of tank gear and I want to start DPSing because my raid doesn't need an extra tank anymore, I now can't do that without going out and collecting a whole new set of gear. The fact that you can change the spec, the traits that you've chosen, adds a lot more flexibility. If one of your tanks is going to be out for a couple of weeks and you need to jump in and tank for your raid, you can just spend a few dozen gold if you haven't been respecking much and shift all your Azariah pieces over to cover that. Or if you're going back and forth regularly between two specs, I think generic traits are also there as an option for that purpose. There's something we go back and forth on a lot philosophically, and I completely understand. Obviously, I don't mean to sound dismissive of course it would be simpler if you could just change these seamlessly and you could operate at full effectiveness, whether you're assassination, whether you're subtlety, whether you're outlaw. But to some extent that is deliberate. We think there's value to at least a bit of friction between changing specs and operating optimally in your other spec. I think someone who is dedicated fully to a given specialization, that is who they are, that is what they are, should have some small advantages over somebody who's seamlessly changing between two specs as the need suits them. And some of that is because we're also looking at balance between hybrids and pure classes. It's a druid, a priest, a shaman may not have multiple options if they want to do damage, whereas a rogue, mage, hunter, warlock can, and that's by design to a certain extent. Subtlety rogues might shine on single target encounters, outlaw may do better with cleave and AoE, but in a world where they can seamlessly do both as the need suits them without any loss of efficiency, that is a very difficult advantage to balance against the rest of the game who doesn't have that option available to them. And again, what we're talking about here is just a few percent, right? It's if you want to play a certain spec for, you try to do your Mythic Plus for the week, or you're just helping your friends out, or you're jumping into PvP, missing one trait or having a slightly less effective trait or wearing a 370 pair of shoulders because you don't have a 385 for the spec that you want, that's going to make you a couple of percent less effective. I get that if you are looking to push, a world first Mythic kill or, top 100 Mythic raid kill, or you're trying to push a Mythic 15 in time, every percent matters. But for the vast majority of the content that you're doing, you're still easily effective enough to accomplish your goals. And in the long term, as we look to increase the availability of Azariah armor, that's something that should become less punishing in that regard too, right? If you only have one 380 or 385 and all of your other pieces in that slot are 340 because you haven't been able to get any others, then swapping that piece out can feel like an unacceptable sacrifice. But I think hopefully with the emissary change that we made recently and increased availability overall, people should find themselves with more options for a given slot.
Okay. And it's kind of thinking over what you're talking about here. It's sort of the sense of, like, say I'm my guild's main tank, right? And I've been devoting all of my gearing and all of my efforts into being the best tank that I possibly can be. I should have a little bit of an advantage over somebody who maybe they play Retribution majority of the time, maybe they play Holy the majority of the time. And I should be a better choice for that tank role in the raid than somebody who's been spending all their time gearing up another spec.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that if you decide you want to change specs, over the course of a few weeks, you can get to that point of optimal efficiency. You replace some of your gear, you refocus your secondary stats, but it's not something you can do just at the drop of a hat. All that said, I think in many ways, one of the lessons we learned from feedback in Legion, I think, has led us to make spec switching much easier in most ways in BFA than it was in Legion. I think if you think back to how those systems worked, especially early on, you had legendaries that were just for a specific spec and nothing could change those. Or you had your artifact power focused on a single artifact and the others were farther behind. Or you got a holy relic drop from a raid boss and you had to decide whether you put it into your holy artifact or your Ashbringer for Ret, and that was a irrevocable choice. And none of those systems exist in those ways in Battle for Azeroth, but we do, like I said, want to preserve a little bit of friction, a little bit of difference, even if it's just a few percent effectiveness between the full-time dedicated assassination rogue and the rogue who just switches when it feels like that's the best suited spec for a fight in a specific case.
I remember when we were first talking about the Azariah system months and months and months ago at this point, and talking about the reforging aspect of it, one of the original ideas that was being kicked around was, well, maybe you can only reforge one Azariah piece once every week or two or something like that. we moved away from that because, like, obviously if you are that retribution paladin and then your tank leaves and it's like, okay, well now I have to go protection, it would suck to have to wait 3 weeks to have all of your Azariah gear be suited for protection.
Exactly. And then 3 more weeks to have it go back to
exactly,
Yeah.
But then that kind of opened up the opposite angle where people were then able to just reforge back and forth constantly, which then those escalating gold costs came in, which actually ties into the next question that we have here, which comes from Turnberry, who says, how does restricting Azarite trait reforging through exponential gold costs improve gameplay? With the new Outer Ring in 8.1, it seems like it will severely punish players who play multiple specs.
Yeah, I think that this flow, ties directly into the last question. It was just as you just mentioned, Josh. It was a solution to trying to come up with a way to solve the problem of, if you feel like you need or want to change specs in a long-term sense, that shouldn't feel punishing or overly restricted. Or also even just maybe you got a better piece for your main spec in this slot, you want to turn your other piece into an elemental piece or a shadow piece to use when you're out questing or DPSing. Those should all be like ready options. The thing we wanted to avoid was turning this into just an extra set of talents effectively with a lot more baggage, where on every boss fight, the same way you might use a Tome of Tranquil Mind and move a couple of talents around in your rows, you also felt, okay, I'm going to go respec all of my Azarite traits to be optimal for this fight, then respec them again to be optimal for the next fight. The way the system works, to be clear, is every time you respec, the cost of respecing doubles, but then it also decays pretty rapidly. I think every 3 days, the cost will halve. So what that means, it starts out, I think, 5 gold. So if you've never respec and you want to change all 3 of your pieces that you use primarily from one spec to the other, let's say you're going from Frost Mage to Fire Mage, that's going to cost you 5 plus 10 plus 20, literally 35 gold, which is basically nothing. And then 6 days later, the cost will be back to 5 gold. Now, if you're trying to respec on a very regular basis, if you're trying to do the thing that the system is designed to restrict, you're going to run into prohibitive costs. And I know, you see the exorbitant, the screenshots that seem comical, where someone is posting their, 80,000 gold respec cost. But the only way they got to that point was by paying 40,000 gold for the prior one and 20,000 gold for the one after that. And all of that said, again, if you just go a week without respecing, that's going to be down to 1/8 of what it was, and then another week 1/8 of that again until it's all the way back down to nearly nothing. So the intent is, you, unlike a lot of items where it is often for a specific spec, what is your loot spec when you killed this boss? This is the trinket that you got. It procs from healing spells. Or this is the shield that you got because you were set to protection spec instead of retribution. Here you have the ability to change the items, but not endlessly, not infinitely, not without restriction.
Okay. And I know we've floated the idea around at certain points about resetting the cost of the Azarite trait reforging if we do large balance passes, or possibly obviously there's a whole bunch of changes coming to traits in Tides of Vengeance. Is that something we're still looking into the possibility of doing?
Yes, that's something that we're definitely looking to do. We didn't have the technical ability to do it. We are working on making that possible for Tides of Vengeance. And then once we have that, we could also use it again in the future if we ever make significant changes to a given class's Azarite traits. We could reset your reforging costs the same way back in the day, talent points would often get refunded when talent changes were made.
Okay, cool. Next question about Azarite gear comes from Eris, who asked, will there be new traits on Mythic plus Azarite gear in 8.1 and beyond, or are those of us focusing on dungeons as our only endgame activity stuck with the same ones for 2 years? So talking about, obviously, we've been pretty clear in the past that the traits that are on the Azarite gear are preset. We specifically choose which traits are on each piece of gear. How are we incorporating that into Mythic Plus, where obviously the items don't really change?
Right. So going into Season 2, all the existing items will have this extra ring on them with 2 traits, which will include some of the new traits that are being added in Tides of Vengeance. And then beyond that, I think we'll continue that philosophy going forward. I can't say with certainty how things are going to work in later patches after this one, but the plan is to continue supporting and evolving the system for all of these endgame progression paths, and Mythic Keystones are obviously a huge part of that.
Okay. Cool. Another Mythic Plus question from Korax, who asked, any plans on changing the way to acquire Azariah gear from Mythic Plus dungeons? The fact you can only get it from the weekly chests at the moment is slightly disappointing and frustrating. This has been one of the most common suggestions as well.
And I would say it's arguably more than slightly disappointing and frustrating. It sucks. It sucks. We're not happy with how that works. We are trying to come up with a middle ground that makes sense for the game as a whole. I think the most common suggestion is we'll just let it drop from end-of-run chests. And clearly that would give you the ability to target specific pieces. They would still only be 370 as opposed to 385 at the high end. But our concern with that approach is that that's great if your playstyle is spamming Mythic Plus all week, which is actually a pretty niche playstyle. Lots and lots and lots of people do Mythic Keystone Dungeons. Most people just do a handful every week, just one or two to get their weekly chest in, and it complements their other gameplay that they're doing. Others have that as their focus, as their sole activity. All the other sources of Azariah armor in the endgame have some sort of restriction on how often you can get them. Right? I mean, there's more control if you're raiding Uldir. You know which boss drops the piece you want. You have a chance to bonus roll it. But at the end of the day, there's just that one shot a week. And if you want, maybe Zul drops your helm, you get your one crack at Zul every week, and if he doesn't drop it, he doesn't drop it. Come back again next week, try again. Same with PvP. You're getting your items either from the conquest progression or from your weekly chest. You can't get Azariah armor from your end of match rewards. And so we have concerns about making end of run Mythic chests the only spammable way of targeting a specific piece, and what that would do to the comparative value and rewards of all of our different endgame tracks. We don't
Right.
Mythic Plus is tremendously rewarding. It's the best way, it's the only way really of getting a crack at a guaranteed 365, 370 level piece of gear on a regular basis, as much time as you want to put into it, compared to say heroic raiding, where you only get that one shot a week per boss. But so we don't want to tip that too far in that direction. That's why we haven't done that. That said, the current system is not great. I know that if you are that player whose focus is dungeons, feeling like you only have this one chance a week at getting an Azariah armor piece, and then you also, if you do get one, it's going to be pulled from this giant pool where you feel like you have very little control or agency when it comes to what that piece is going to be. That's not a satisfactory place. We are still discussing solutions to this problem. We want to solve the problem. We want to give ways of having more reliable access to Azariah armor if you were a dungeon-oriented player, as well as some ability to target, if there's a specific piece from Temple of Sethralus that you're interested in, we'd like there to be some way for you to express that and pursue that goal. It's an ongoing discussion. We don't have a specific solution to announce right now, but to be clear, the answer is definitely we agree this is a problem. It's a problem we want to solve.
Okay. Well, that's good news at least. And I can understand how just straight up adding it to Mythic Plus, there's a lot of extra knock-on effects to have to worry about at that point.
Exactly.
So
I think, and again, with a lot of this, if the end game were just Mythic Dungeons, we would do that.
Sure.
But we're trying to create and balance and maintain a holistic end game that has multiple play styles, multiple progression paths, and to keep those balanced against one another.
Yeah, and there's already a lot of players who there'll be a specific trinket or something that they feel like this is the best trinket for me, so I need to farm this one dungeon over and over and over and over and over again until I get that. A lot of players are okay with that. A lot of players are not. So adding more of that into the game, I could see why we would want to be careful about doing that. Question from I'm Frode on Twitter, who asked, what's the deal with traits that require... This one kind of sounds like a Jerry Seinfeld. What's the deal with traits that... That's a terrible impression, I'm sorry. With traits that require third-party sites like Wowhead to explain what they actually do. Resetting I cannot talk. You guys can read it. Resetting traits can quickly reach insane gold costs, so testing on your own is not a good option.
Yes. What, you mean you don't naturally know what the power of the Horde is, and when a trait says it's going to fill you with the power of a Spirit of the Horde, that makes perfect sense? Yeah, no.
To me anyway.
We're going to fix those in the next patch. I think that's the specific one in question. I think what it actually does is it has a chance. It drops a random banner that's themed after your own race. So if you're a Horde player, you got to see an Orc banner or a Troll banner or a Forsaken banner. Those each have different effects or give you a secondary stat bonus of a different type.
Okay.
And so I think that was just a fallback tooltip from a designer who, it's a whole lot to try to encapsulate in a single tooltip. We're going to revisit the design and the way we express it and make it clearer. It's not reasonable to ask you, we agree, to choose between something vague and something that very clearly says it, procs 3,500 nature damage when you do X, which is at least understandable.
Sounds good. Makes sense. Question from John Has Skittles on Twitter said, will you be retiring any of the older traits in 8.1? Right now it just feels like there are so many of them, and the newer 8.1 traits will end up being so few compared to the older ones. And I know we said previously that we weren't going to, but that's been an ongoing discussion since then.
Yes. So I mean, we're adding a number of new traits that people have been seeing that have started to pop up on the PTR, and you'll see new ones with each upcoming build. But yes, we are also going to be retiring and, in fact, replacing some specific traits across various specs that have just been unpopular, less successful designs. I think there's some that we've looked at that weren't particularly popular, and it was down to tuning, and we could just fix the numbers and it would be fine. There are others where really it was either too simple, frankly a bit on the boring side, or there wasn't an adequate tuning knob to make it powerful enough to be desirable without breaking some aspect of the class or rotation. And so we're just going to retire those and introduce new ones in their place.
All right. So let's move on from Azariah. We'll talk a little bit about, we got a couple of class questions in here. We don't normally hit class questions, but there were some pretty good ones that came in. Question here from Anti, who said, are tanks being looked at? It's extremely underwhelming that guilds are mostly looking for brewmasters and DKs because they are way too strong compared to the others. I know that we've been talking a lot with the class team about tank balance. Do we have any updates to share along those lines here today?
Yes. Tank balance is definitely something the team is looking at. We agree that both Brewmasters and Death Knights probably have a bit too much in the way of overall survivability compared to other tanks. On the other end of the spectrum, Protection Warrior and Guardian Druid feel like they're lagging behind. So some of that is numerical tuning. Some of that is also, especially on the side of Prot Warrior, just overall rotational flow, and there are issues there that go beyond just numbers that are being looked at and discussed, and I think we're hoping to get some changes out to PTR in the not too distant future there. I think at the same time, I think it's also important to frame the discussion of what tanks bring to the picture. And yes, damage taken per second or external healing required, that's a very real metric, and that's one that we want to be relatively balanced overall, recognizing that there's some tanks that are going to be better against magical damage, some tanks that are better against physical damage. There's some different sources and nuances there. But at the end of the day, if you feel like you can't keep tank A alive despite your best efforts, then tank B feels nearly unkillable. Of course, that's going to be a problem and something we need to address balance-wise. That said, beyond that, I think when evaluating tanks, a lot of it also we'd like to be a question of what's their broader toolkit, right? What else are they bringing to a dungeon? What are they bringing to a raid? Whether it's abilities like Death Grip or, there are times where something like Spell Reflect was incredibly useful, even situationally, but to the point where it became a major, major advantage to have that tank present, to have that tank represented. And also, finally, a lot of the elements that make a tank skilled, I think, aren't quantifiable in terms of the, damage taken per second or healing required metrics. I think it's been interesting following discussions, actually, speaking of brewmasters in this question. I think there's been a lot of interesting discussion in the brewmaster community in the last couple of days over some log analysis and comparing incoming damage profiles depending on whether you were keeping your iron skin up as much as you theoretically should be, or whether you're purifying more at the expense of that uptime, and what's the right way to play, and what are the costs of playing correctly and poorly, and what does that mean for the skill ceiling or the skill floor of a given spec. And again, like, the numerical stuff matters, but at the end of the day, I don't think we're trying to make tanking or and to stress our tanks in a way where they're constantly in danger of falling over. I think very rare encounters notwithstanding, or aspects of certain tyrannical bosses or high necrotic encounters in dungeons notwithstanding, feeling like you were doing everything correctly but you lost because your tank just dropped over dead isn't really a particularly satisfying mode of gameplay. It's something we've, I think, moved steadily away from over the years. long ago, going way back 10 years at this point, it actually wasn't uncommon to have bosses that had the ability to literally two-shot a tank if they had a bad avoidance streak. That sucks. So if we're not, now yes, taxing healer mana matters, and a tank who plays well, who manages their active mitigation, they should require less healing. And I think it's interesting. I think in the specific Brewmaster logs that are being discussed, the gap between correctly played and poorly played was something like 15% in terms of the additional healing required. Which, on the one hand, some argue, well, that's not a whole lot. On the other hand, 15% in today's balanced climate.
Yeah.
If a spec is 15% behind another, we're consistently told that is unplayable and useless.
We were just talking earlier about reforging an Azariah trait for like 2% for 80,000 gold.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But anyway, all of that said, I think the skill in being a tank is often more about just overall battlefield management. It's about positioning, anticipation, taunting that new ad that came in, charging over to interrupt something or lock it down. And I think if you ask melee DPS especially, the biggest difference, it's very obvious when you're playing with a very good tank versus an average tank, just in terms of how mindful they are about how the boss or how enemies in a dungeon are positioned or faced. Can you get to them easily without having to stand in bad things? Or can you cleave this ad that spawned? Or are you having to, choose between one or the other? Like, that's the stuff that I think is the real guts of tank gameplay, whereas damage dealing gameplay is often much more quantifiable, and it's just like, hey, how quickly can you kill this thing? How big is your number? I think when it comes to tanks, we're looking to dial in damage taken per second numbers and healing required numbers, but we'd rather continue to expand and diversify the toolkits that they bring that make them great battlefield commanders when they're leading a raid or leading a group through a mythic dungeon, because I think that's a big part of the tank fantasy. I think it's not just doing a DPS style rotation and minimizing your damage taken. That's part of it, but it's far from the whole picture.
Okay. And one other thing that I can add on to that from talking with the class team the other day also is that we're looking into tank damage as well, the actual amount of damage that tanks put out. So keep an eye out for some tuning changes along those lines, most likely on the PTR. Mm-hmm. Question from Darkani, who said, Resto Shaman are decent stacked healers and abysmal spread healers, while other healers excel at both. We're also the most unappealing Mythic Plus healer. What spec and talent changes can we expect based off the immense feedback you've been given?
We have indeed received a lot of feedback. Thank you, Shaman. Thank you, others. So healer balance also on our radar. I think, again, Shaman are probably... There's a couple of issues here. I think it's accurate that Shaman excel when there are stacked clumps of people. I think, their signature spell has been Chain Heal for a long time. When Healing Rain was added to their toolkit, that, kind of cemented them as a healer that thrives in environments where people are going to be, clumped in predictable locations, which comes up a whole lot in a wide range of encounters. But then on the other hand, you have your, Mythic Fetid Devourers and other things where people are forcibly spread out. And it's correct that they are less effective there in terms of their raw throughput. It is a problem if it feels like they're so far behind that you're better off bringing an undergeared healer of a different spec that's, someone's alt than a very well-geared, skilled shaman. That's something that we need to fix. And so I'm not sure that that's a question of, massive spec or talent redesign. Some of that is just strengthening some baseline spells, strengthening, your throughput if you are, just using more Riptides and more single target heals versus Chain Heal and Healing Rain. Also, I think with Resto Shaman in particular, there's the talent row, like you feel like you probably want to take Ascendance to do dungeons, which means that you don't take High Tide, which means that the way it's tuned currently, Chain Heal is basically, if you don't have High Tide, you probably shouldn't be using Chain Heal as a spell very much, which significantly limits your toolkit there. So I think there are definitely changes you want to make on that front. On the other end of the spectrum, I think there are definitely a couple of healers that are too effective right now that are also kind of overshadowing others as a result. I think it's a problem that Shaman feel like even in their situations that are optimal for them, they're still often coming out behind, say, Disc Priests. Disc Priests are something that really very much emerged in the last month because they have a very, very high skill ceiling in particular. It's interesting, if you look at Heroic Uldir, you actually see Disc behind Holy and faring, they're still very strong, but closer to the middle of the pack, closer to the average, whereas at the very highest levels in Mythic raids, and this is also spilling over into PvP, into Battlegrounds, into dungeons, they have the potential to do more throughput than other healers while doing a fair amount of damage and being very versatile, yeah, that's a problem. Like, we clearly, if one class has strengths and weaknesses and there's another class that's more of a jack of all trades, the jack of all trades shouldn't beat the first class in the areas of their strength, or we have a balance problem. That's one that we're looking at fixing. And again, the tank stuff, the healer stuff, I think at this point we're likely going to be targeting this upcoming Tides of Vengeance update for those changes. We don't want to, guilds and groups have their comp solidified. They've geared up certain classes at this point. They've learned many encounters relying on certain classes. We don't want to just hotfix change that out from under you, and we'd rather give a lot of advance notice as we head towards a major patch.
Right.
So I think those are the things that we're looking to address. Now, all of that said, and I know, just I guess another philosophical note. I think, again, healing per second matters a ton, but I think it's also these days overrated a little bit or overstated in importance compared to damage per second for a damage dealer. I think there have always been historical comparisons between a damage reduction cooldown and something like Tranquility, right? If you are relying on Devo Aura or the equivalent, well, that's not reflected in healing logs, whereas the Divine Hymn or Trank, that is. And yet they're both actually absorbing significant amounts of damage, reducing significant amounts of damage. And there are other aspects to why you might want a certain healer present that, again, aren't reflected in who has the highest HPS. And on the Shaman front, Spirit Link is, by definition, generally HPS neutral. It's taking health from some, giving it to others, and then reducing some incoming damage. None of that is really reflected in your overall healing throughput.
Right.
But it's probably the best healing cooldown in the game in most situations. That's a huge reason to have a Resto Shaman present. Or, in a couple different talent rows, you very commonly see people take damage reduction totems like Earthen Wall that are reflected in healing meters versus Ancestral Vigor that's increasing the health of your targets by 10% on a max health basis that may save lives when you're Riptide that's going on somebody who's taking damage. You're now giving them a larger health pool. You're buffering them against something that otherwise would have killed them. That's a great reason to have a shaman present. But if all you're looking at is who generates the highest healing per second on a sustained basis, those things aren't captured there.
Right.
And so maybe we can do a better job of trying to surface or message those in ways that are clearer to raid leaders, to pug leaders who are trying to evaluate who they should bring. And finally, sorry, I know I'm kind of rambling here. That doesn't mean, none of what I said should be taken to mean that we don't think there are numbers problems as well. There also are those, but it's we want to take a multifaceted approach to the problem.
Okay. Question from Hex Zero, who said, the current PvP meta of everybody having tons of self-heal plus insane burst damage and healing, controlling the flow of battle, has left quote-unquote rot classes in the dust. Unholy DKs and Affliction Locks feel useless. Any plans to address? And I know that that we posted a few weeks ago that we were looking at Unholy DKs and Affliction Warlocks. Do we have any updates on what's going on there?
Yes, so I think some of that is, and this isn't a direct response to this, I know their survivability is definitely something that's on our radar also. Like, those are lower mobility specs, lower mobility classes that we want them to feel a bit tankier. And so currently it often feels like you might just get tunneled and not really have much recourse in those situations. We'd like to help on that front. Now, the overall pacing of arena matches is something that we're definitely looking at. We think it's important that there be room for pressure comps as well as burst comps. And if your goal is just to steady attrition, wearing down healer mana until you eventually can line up a kill, that should be a viable approach. Now, on the Affliction Lock side, too, some of that is down to Affliction historically has been that spread dot pressure spec. Some recent changes in BFA made them a bit more single target oriented, which we've seen in other parts of the game, too. And I think that's not totally consistent with our vision or I think players' expectations of what Affliction Lock should be about. We'd like to pull them a bit more towards that multi-dotting place that they're better known for. Anyway, also, yes, all of this is on our radar. I think at this point, we're also trying to strike a balance between rapid reaction to things that we see coming out of weekend tournaments or trends at the high end of the ladder, but also letting the metagame evolve, letting comps establish themselves, letting counter comps rise to counter those. And I think there's risk of too much ongoing, constant change, buffing and nerfing and buffing and nerfing that can stop a meta from ever really settling out. We have, this is Battle for Azeroth PvP Season 1. There are several to follow, and if at the end of the day this season is known more for a faster pace and for higher burst overall, but in a later season or in a subsequent season that starts to shift a little bit, I think that may be a valid approach for us to take rather than trying to just change the meta out from under people. But yeah, philosophically, we definitely agree there should be room for pressure and rot comps and not just, lining up burst and securing a kill that way. Separately, sources of healing like survivability, hybrid healing especially, are something that we are looking to continually and more actively, I think we have been via hotfix and will continue to dial back. And that's something that also, can help overall, raise the effectiveness of steady pressure when you don't have all of this healing coming from different sources, and instead more of that is leaning on a single healer with a fixed mana pool to try to cover.
Okay, cool. And as for the changes that we were talking about for Unholy Death Knights and Afflictional Locks a few weeks ago, keep an eye out on the PTR for those, actually. Believe from what I was talking with the class team about, the decision ended up being that they needed more than just some basic numerical tuning. So keep an eye out for, I believe they're looking into some changes for honor talents. So keep an eye out for that on the PTR. Also, I thought I had a question in here about Shadow Priests. I don't, but Shadow Priests, we're looking at you too. So yes, don't worry about that. Well, continue worrying about that. Continue giving feedback, but keep an eye out. Anyway, I got some questions about Warfronts here. This one comes from Trivia Cow, who says, Moo. Obviously.
Of course. Thank you, Trivia Cow.
Yep. Will the new Warfront run its cycle in parallel with the current one? So instead of waiting 3 to 4 weeks for a new cycle, you start a new one every 1 to 2 weeks. I'm talking about the new Darkshore Warfront coming in, Tides of Vengeance.
Yes. So yeah, the current plan is, they will run in parallel. We want to kick off Tides of Vengeance with Alliance attacking Darkshore right away. So not even contributing to attack, but day one, if you're Alliance, you can jump in, do the intro quest, queue for the Warfront, and go from there. And so effectively with this cycle of 2 areas that are now contested, 2 pieces of outdoor content, there'll be the Warfront availability twice as often. You might find yourself currently being able to queue for the Arathi Warfront and do that while also having access to Darkshore and the outdoor quests and world boss there. And then that will flip-flop, but over time, basically doubling the amount of availability.
Okay, and it's not like a hard set like when Arathi is attackable for Horde, then Darkshore is attackable for Alliance, but just starting it off in a way that makes sure that at least initially there's some sort of
exactly. And I think they'll both have their independent contribution cycles. I think the way it naturally works. I think we saw this a little bit with the buildings in Broken Shore and 7.2 last expansion. If there's 2 bars to fill, people naturally gravitate towards the one that's closest to filling, which will make it so that, yes, technically they could both be active at the same time. In practice, they're very likely to cycle back and forth and be more staggered so that it has an organic feel to it. It's not a rigid, like, okay, now that we're attacking Arathi, it's your turn to take Darkshore.
Right.
But the overall feel is likely to be that you're probably going to be attacking one and defending the other at any given time.
Okay. Question from Bullis, who said, any comment on why we still can't queue as raid groups for the Warfronts? This has been a pretty common request.
So this was a decision that was made about midway through Warfront development during beta in BFA. And it's about just the overall pacing of the Warfront experience. And we did internal playtests with full raid groups. And what we found was, while we had a lot of positive feedback and positive experiences when it was solo players or small groups getting together, it actually wasn't a whole lot of fun for large groups. The reason for that is it's not a tuning concern, right? We let you queue with an entire raid group if you want for LFR, and you can take your heroic raid guild and steamroll an LFR wing in 10 minutes flat. And yeah, it's not particularly hard, but if you want to trivialize content, fine, go ahead, go nuts. The problem with Warfronts is that with a full raid group working together with a couple of tanks supporting healers, full 20-person communication, what often happened was you would just steamroll the map objectives and get very far ahead of the pacing of the other base building, resource collection, other mechanisms. It's kind of like a giant version of something like, Hellfire Assault or, other similar gauntlet raid encounters where doesn't matter if your DPS is too far ahead of the pacing of the encounter, it makes the
Right.
encounter less fun. So the reason why we didn't do it was not it would be too easy. It was just a less fun experience. And so in practice, we've focused on making it a random queued. You can take a few friends in and focus on objectives. And overall, what we've seen with the pacing of how it plays out on live, the average warfront length, just around the time you're typically taking over most of the middle of the map, is around the time you've probably got your armory, got your workshop up, you're building those siege engines, and you're ready to go finish the map. If you had the whole map controlled and then had to wait 15 minutes for all of your siege engines to build, that's just not a super fun experience. All that said, totally get there's desire and things are more exciting when you can play them with a large group of friends, and so that's something we've been talking about. How and when we can add a new mode for the existing warfronts that is actually tuned around a raid group. Whether we call this heroic version of the warfront or whatever remains to be seen, but this is something we'd like to deliver. But the initial experience that we released with BFA was focused and tuned and paced around just mass accessibility for the average player who is just queuing with a few friends or just solo queuing. We wanted to make sure that we could nail the pacing for that without worrying about, oops, there's also a 10-player raid group in here who just steamrolled the whole map, and now people are overall feeling like they're having less fun.
Okay, so current warfronts geared around or designed around the notion of everybody in there is most people in there are completely pickup, but looking at the potential of adding some more raid-tuned warfronts in the future. Cool. Got a couple questions about allied races here. First one comes from Genka, who says, do you have any plans to readjust the Death Knight starting area / questline for the introduction of new allied races?
So not currently. I think currently, allied races, many of them have their own little self-contained starting experiences. Their story fits very directly into Battle for Azeroth's narrative arc. That said, completely understand that if Death Knight's your favorite class, or you play a Death Knight and you've just unlocked this race that you really want to be, you want to be a Void Elf Death Knight or a Magkar Death Knight, not having that option available at all kind of sucks. And so we don't have any plans to announce right now, but that's definitely something we do want to address in the future.
Okay. Question from Thomas, who said, are there any plans to relax the unlock requirements around the Legion allied races? So Nightborne, High Mountain, Lightforge.
Yes, so we have some. So in
there we go.
in the next, so in Tides of Vengeance, the upcoming content patch, we are I think roughly doubling the amount of reputation awarded by the various old world quests. So you can get your Augustian reach rep, you can get your Army the light rep twice as fast as you could previously to just kind of speed those along now that they're not really content that anyone's doing for any reason other than going back to unlock these allied races.
Okay, that's good news. Let's just move on. Next question. We got a few questions that are more rating focused. This one comes from Sicarius, who says, how do you think the Siege of Zuldazar raid layout will affect the world first race, since Horde and Alliance will have bosses in different orders? So when we did the Tides of Vengeance sort of reveal stream a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about Siege of Zuldazar. Well, you were talking about Siege of Zuldazar and how it's kind of two stories being told from opposing sides, the Horde defending Zuldazar and the Alliance attacking it. How does that affect the world first race?
So I guess, a couple things. So as of now, we're currently actually thinking that we're going to call the raid Battle of Dazar'alor, because technically it's not a siege. It's this naval pincer attack from both sides, unlike Siege of Orgrimmar that was, this whole assembled army in front of the gates. Also, Zuldazar is the entire zone. It's not like the actual capital city. The pyramid that's being attacked is Dazar'alor. So we'll see. We'll name still under discussion, but that's what we're currently thinking. Raid layout. So the current thinking is actually the 9 bosses that exist may actually be faced in the same order between the two factions. That is to say, for Alliance, they may play through the entire battle up to facing Rastakhan, and then have the recap of what they missed told through the eyes of a survivor of the Horde attack and the naval battle with Jaina once they complete that. Whereas for Horde players, they may actually get their flashback moment actually in the middle of the raid. Once they reach Rastakhan, find what's happened to him, and then are told, hey, this is what the Alliance did before you got here. Here's how that played out, before they then resume and finish off their version of the story.
Okay.
So in practice, boss 9 effectively may be the same boss for both factions. That said, there are going to be some mechanical differences. There are going to be some differences here between the two experiences. And, I know that will cause some debate over, does the world first really matter if this was different than what the other faction was doing? I think I trust the community to figure that out. And if the answer is, hey, for this tier, we're going to say there's a Horde first and there's going to be Alliance first, and people can argue over which one was real or which one was more, impactful, so be it. I think, the world first race is something that, is obviously it's intriguing. It's always amazing seeing the very, very best raiders in the world practice their craft. And it was, super cool watching Method do it live through Uldir last month. But we're building our raids to present an epic experience, to tell a story, to, create engaging and immersive battles for millions of players. And we're always going to prioritize the depth of that experience over the nuances of the race. While it's something that we take into account, we wouldn't throw out an otherwise, I think, pretty cool idea to really deliver this asymmetrical faction experience through raiding just because it might cause some controversy over who the real world first was.
Yeah, it'll still be an exciting world first race pretty much regardless as well. So we'll have to see. I think it's interesting, like, looking at this, the world first race isn't something that Blizzard created. Like, that was something that the community sort of bandied around. And it was really the community that created the world first race and developed it into what it is nowadays. So it's kind of up to the community to decide how to treat the world first race.
And the official Hall of Fame that we now have on our website has a separate Horde section, separate Alliance section. So,
question from Jarthan, who said, raid trinkets in Uldir have been terrible in comparison to other trinkets outside of the raid with no changes. Can we expect better tuning in 8.1? Or do we need to keep hoping for higher Titanforge trinkets from Mythic Plus or World Quests?
So, yes, hopefully we can expect better tuning. I think obviously there are a few good trinkets in there here and there. I think for, the Zarlor raid, I think we'll have an exciting new crop of them. It's something we've actually, like, we agree. We look at the same data and we're looking at the same sims and understand that, increasingly the community values a lot of trinkets from dungeons or even from world quests or emissaries, theoretically, if you could get them to Titanforge high enough, over raid trinkets. We've asked ourselves, like, why is that? I think part of the conclusion that we've come to is that it has to do with how we're building and budgeting those trinkets, and there are adjustments we can make there to our philosophies going forward. I think raid trinkets we try to make deliberately more interesting. We try to, they're often more flavorful, often directly themed after boss abilities of the boss that drops them. And so, while a world quest trinket might just be its strength, proc crit, the raid trinket might be your attacks have a chance to inject the target with some toxin, and when it reaches this number of stacks, it explodes and does a certain thing. The key difference is that latter effect often is fixed in its throughput, and there aren't as many interactions with player action or player skill. Whereas when we just say we're giving you a lot more primary and secondary stat, whether it's a stat stick or a proc trinket, if I am twice as good a player as you, if I do 15,000 DPS and you do 8,000 DPS with the same gear, that trinket is also going to be more effective for me than it is for you. Whereas the flat proc damage trinket, or has a chance to trigger an AoE effect that has a flat amount of damage, will actually do an equal amount of damage for both of us. And the sims that are used to guide a lot of gearing decisions these days are assuming optimal gameplay. They're assuming you're fighting Patrick or you're fighting an AoE set of targets and playing perfectly. And so those passive stat trinkets are given their full theoretical possible value that many players in practice won't be able to achieve. But those are being compared against, like, that scaling value at its very highest point is being compared against the fixed value of raid trinkets. And so it may just, we don't want to stop making interesting and flavorful raid trinkets. I mean,
sure,
we could solve this problem by just saying raid trinkets are mastery proc int and crit proc strength and leave it at that. Instead, I think we just need to revisit our tuning philosophies and the way we build some of these trinkets to make sure that they are still comparable to the best ones out there. I think we obviously can do this. It's just a question of numbers, right? Draft of Souls was in Legion was a triggered unused damage effect, but if the number is high enough, it can be good enough. We just need to better calibrate how we're making them.
Okay. Question from Jugs, who said, rating has lost its uniqueness with the removal of tier sets, endgame weapons, and trinkets also coming from Mythic Plus, etc. Any plans to bring uniqueness back to raids? I mean, obviously, there's the unique aspect of there's significantly more people and the encounters are significantly more involved. But talking about like the specific itemization in raids, is there any?
Yes, for sure. I mean, and obviously, there are titles and there are unique gear sets, and there are things you can get from raiding that you can't get elsewhere. I think definitely, it used to be a long time ago that the only way to get good end game loot was raiding. Period, and there were no alternative sources. The so-called raid or die era. We've moved away from that deliberately, and I think there's a ton of people who are enjoying just doing Mythic Plus and focusing on hard content with a small group of friends. But at the same time, we want to make sure that there is still something special and rewarding for those who enjoy getting together a larger group of people and dealing with raiding. Tier sets were a piece of that, though honestly, I don't know that they really fit the bill there either in the long run. If you look at a tier like Antorus, many people could jump into pugs and relatively quickly get their set pieces at a certain level, get those set bonuses within the first few weeks of doing the raid, especially if you're in a better guild that's clearing that content early. The set pieces didn't feel like the long-term goal that they once had, like way back, a decade ago in classic days, where it might be a year-long journey to get your full, 10 storm set together. The tier pieces in Legion and Warlords and Mists were something that you probably got within a few weeks. And then after that, well, what was the thing that differentiated raiding from the rest of the game for the whole rest of the tier? So, yes, we this is something to think about. It's something that we'd like to do more regarding. It's something we're looking at, itemization, flavor. Just because we don't have 4-piece formal sets doesn't mean we can't have smaller sets, like little 2-piece sets here and there, or items with flavorful effects like Drape of Shame from Karazhan or the Anchor Chain Girdle, things like that have come from dungeons. We'd like to start to do more of that across the game in general, so that, yes, if you're looking to get your item level up, there's equal progression paths, but each one of these systems should offer some unique and flavorful rewards that aren't available in the others, that help differentiate folks who focus on one from folks who focus on the other.
Okay. Starting to run out of time here, so we're going to move on a little bit here. Question here from Tyrus, who said, any concrete plans to make island objectives more varied? Current structure is just AoE and mine your way to the finish.
Yep. So, yeah, obviously getting Azariah is always going to be the objective of Island Expeditions. The thing we're looking to vary significantly is just how you get that Azariah. I mean, killing rare spawns and killing creatures is always going to be part of the overall experience, but we're looking to add a lot more unique objectives and events that you can come across on those islands. So, one example of a new thing in Tides of Vengeance is extraction points, where you can take that point over and set up an Azariah extractor for your faction that will actually give you a steady trickle of Azariah for the duration of the map. However, just kind of like a control point in a place like a Arathi Basin or a battleground, the other faction's forces can come in and capture that and convert it to their side. So you might need to loop back occasionally or have someone keep an eye on it to make sure the other faction isn't taking it away from you. And that's just one example of several, right? I think we want to get away from islands feeling a bit too formulaic. I think that there are differences in the creatures that will spawn from week to week, differences in the environment, but I think we've all probably seen that giant Azariah golem surrounded by lucrative stalagmites more times than we care to, and we'd like to significantly reduce that, and part of that is just increasing overall variety.
Okay. Question here from Nayrok, who said, you said that RP servers would not be affected by cross-realm sharding, yet I've seen many servers sharded into Emerald Dream. What's going on?
Okay, so the way RP servers work is, except for the new zones, they do not shard. They do not have any default cross-realm zone stuff enabled. So when you're in Stormwind, you're in Westfall, you're in Northrend, it's just people from your server. At the very, in the latest content, this is how it worked in Legion. Sharding is necessary in order to keep server stability fine. I think compared to how the game was back in the day, there are actually many times more people on any given realm at the high end than there were in the past. And a zone actually just doesn't support 1,500 people all in it trying to do world quests at the same time in the same space, both from a performance perspective, server-wise and client-wise, and just gameplay trying to get spawns. And so we need to have sharding enabled even on RP servers in Kultiris and Zandalar. Now, if you're talking about war mode in particular, there's a couple of extra factors here where war mode, normally our sharding logic tries to keep people from the same server together and only mixes in other servers if needed because the shards are underpopulated. War mode discards that and focuses on trying to maintain faction balance above everything else because that's essential for war mode gameplay. And then the final piece of this is, of course, there's a lot of just cross-server groups and pre-made group finder. If you're using that to do world quests, if you're jumping into a world boss group, like that's not the game sharding people or putting people onto your server. That's them joining a group, and that you will see those groups running around. If someone joins a war mode group, it's going to be people from any different server that happen to see that group and signed up running around, and that's just player construct, not something on our end.
Okay. So for a server like Emerald Dream, which has been historically PvP focused, now that war mode is in the equation here, do we have anything that can sort of bring back that RP PvP sort of mindset?
So, not currently. In terms of the way the system works, I think it's something where we can look at the numbers and try to understand whether specific servers like Emerald Dream would be able to support a healthy gameplay experience on their own. I think the problem is many other servers also have very sharp faction imbalances, and so having just a pool that only contained people from that server wouldn't make for a satisfying PvP experience for anybody. But we'll look into it and see if they could truly stand on their own and have a good experience. We can probably look into tech solutions to let select realms have the experience that they're looking for, but that's not currently how it works.
Okay. Question here. See how much time we got. We can probably do 2 more questions here. Here's a good one. It comes from Wasselin, who says, you hinted at a change to the group finder for Mythic Plus, such as being able to search by key level. Are those still in the works?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's there's just some design questions we're still working through there in terms of, the system knowing what keystone you're listing the group for, making it clear if you are, asking someone to bring their key as opposed to having one, and then also being able to search for a range as opposed to a specific number, right? Some people may want any 10 or higher. Some people may just be looking for Temple of Sethralus keys because of a specific item they want there. There's a few aspects of the design that we're still working through, but we want to make this tool friendlier for folks who are using it to find Mythic Plus groups.
Okay. And this will be our last question for the day. It comes from Runatus on Twitter, who asked, currently, finishing the war campaign to get the 5th follower takes a while. Any plans to make it more alt-friendly?
Yes, I think in general, alt-friendliness is a topic that we've discussed a lot for the upcoming content update, because we know a lot of folks are looking to get caught up and getting more alts to max level. So there's a few aspects to this. On the war campaign side, currently, when you finish those individual story chapters, they actually give you hardly any reputation at all, and all your reputation comes from world quests, one-time bounty boards, emissaries. We're actually adding significant amounts of rep to those war campaign chapters, kind of like we did to the Suramar storyline back in Legion, so that just finishing one will, catapult you pretty close to being able to unlock the next, and so be able to more sequentially play through them, especially since we're adding new war campaign chapters, to the story in Tides of Vengeance. Separately, I think other catch-up things we're looking at, we know that, with Horde and Alliance assaults coming to the shores of Kultiris and Zandalar, there's going to be new ways to level alts outside of the usual questing route. We've recently improved Island Expedition experience, and so we're seeing characters that are hitting max level through those methods that can end up in slightly awkward situations in terms of what is available to them in the world. Another problem we're looking to solve there is actually flight paths. I think we're currently working on making a BOA book that lets your max level characters learn all the flight paths that you've unlocked on your other characters, so that, again, it's like if you've leveled through Island Expeditions, cool, you just hit 120, you have world quests unlocked on your account, you want to go do a Mythic 0 dungeon, or you want to go do world quests, having to spend 2 or 3 hours just literally riding around the entire world, re-unlocking every flight path, not a super fun experience. it's not an issue if you're leveling naturally through questing, but if you're not, it's something we want to fix. So things like that and more. We're definitely looking to do more to improve the alt experience overall.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you as always.
Q&A. Yeah. Thanks everybody who submitted questions. Hopefully we got answers to some pretty good ones in there.
Yeah.
So.
And for everyone else, we will see you at BlizzCon, where we're going to have a whole lot more to talk about and some exciting news about what's in store for Battle for Azeroth and, of course, WoW Classic.
Yeah, BlizzCon's going to be big, guys. You're definitely going to want to check that out. That's it from us. Thanks again, guys, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.